The next panel is on lunar exploration. And there's been a great deal of discussion and talk in the news media and other places about humans going to Mars. I don't believe they're going to go to Mars without going to the moon. So I think the moon is really our next destination. And even the administration here in this country has said that we're going to go to the moon. But right now there isn't really a formulated plan to do that. NASA has a program they call the Lunar Gateway, which there's been a lot of criticism of because the Lunar Gateway is a space station that's going to orbit a space station. And I don't think that makes a lot of sense, because you got a natural space station there called the moon. And to go ahead with the expense of building something that would be orbiting the moon, I don't think is really as effective as going right to the moon like we've done in the past. And I think the moon is of interest to the international community. Certainly our Chinese colleagues and our Russian colleagues and our friends from Europe and Canada and Japan all talk about the moon, and so also India. And so I think there's a lot of interest in the moon, but certainly a lot of uncertainty how we're going to get there. But I think it's clear that if we do go, we ought to do it with international cooperation. And there's a question really, I think, whether you continue building a large booster like the SLS, which NASA's building, or you take advantage of boosters that are available on the commercial market, so to speak, from SpaceX and Blue Origin. But in any case, we ought to be doing it together. So I think we have a very interesting panel that's been put together, and a very good moderator, Leroy Chow. So we'll go ahead and hear what they have to say about lunar exploration.
Okay, thank you, George. Well, it's certainly my pleasure and honor to moderate this panel, especially with such an experienced and august group of folks and experts on this. The moon, of course, as George said, is the new focus. We've kind of pivoted back towards the moon, which I also agree is the right direction to go in. People have been, or humans have been fascinated by the moon ever since the caveman days, when it really was not understood at all what they were looking at. And we, of course, finally reached the moon with Apollo 11. And that was a big deal for me personally. I was an 8-year-old at the time, and that's the event that kind of inspired me to want to become an astronaut myself. The problem, as George also pointed out, is basically for the last, at least 10 years, we have had no real program. Okay, supposedly we had a Mars program, supposedly now we have a moon program, but we don't really have the funding commitments or the political commitment for that matter. We're slowly building hardware, true. We are still building hardware, and of course the commercial efforts are hopefully going to come online at the beginning of the end of next year. But as far as the moon program, there have been a lot of proposals. A lot of countries have expressed interest, most notably China, which a couple of years ago basically opened up to what had been an open secret, that China does harbor ambitions of sending their own astronauts to the moon. So I'm not going to speak too long here. I want to introduce the panel. We've got a very good panel, good group of folks here. So I'll just say a few words for each individual and then let them go ahead and say a few words before we begin with the discussion and questions. So first, we have Jean-Loup. And again, I'm going to keep the introduction short just because we have so many panel members. But Jean-Loup, of course, a veteran astronaut and Air Force pilot, general in the French Air Force. He got to fly on 3 space missions in 3 separate spacecraft, which is pretty cool. His first mission was aboard Salyut and Salyut 7, and then he also flew aboard the Mir space station, and then came to join the NASA program and flew aboard Space Shuttle as well. Since leaving the space flight business, Jean-Loup has been involved in different business ventures, and of course has been a regular participant in ISMS. So Jean-Loup.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Leroy. Thank you, George. I had a chance to start international cooperation because I think it's a subject tonight. 40 years ago, starting in Moscow, at a time when conditions were not what we have now. That was still the Soviet Union. And very quickly I understood the role of human relations in a very special world, and later, after again many years and time spent also here and again in Russia and in Europe, and I saw that the need for international cooperation is evident for all of us who share the same passion, but it's much less evident for the political world. And happily, the price we pay to satisfy our dreams is high. We use taxpayers' money, and so we depend on the decisions of politicians. And politicians, very quickly, I understood that they behave like religion leaders, which is not surprising because politics are religions. And then your language is not the same as when you talk to your colleagues here or there. And to convince politicians, you need to have the right tools. And you know that the tendency of politician leaders or religion leaders is to keep you in the Middle Age. And nowadays, chance for us in this international cooperation is probably also, I think we have talks about that, commercial aspect and private aspect of space exploration. These people also have a religion, but it's kind of different. They don't care much about politics, they just care about money and business. Now, if they feel they can make money abroad and by working with other people, they will do it. So I guess in the future, and step by step, we will have more and more involvement of the private sector, and to go back to the moon and go further down in space, I am sure the private sector will help us.
Okay, thank you, Jean-Loup. Our next panelist, of course, needs no introduction. Walt Cunningham of Apollo 7, 50th anniversary of Apollo 7's mission to the Earth orbit to prove out the spacecraft. And we just saw that very interesting old film. And we're going to hear a lot more from Walt tonight about that mission. But just to tell you a little bit about Walt, he's, of course, a U.S. Marine, a United States Marine. He's a fighter pilot, flew 54 night missions in Korea, which is pretty darn impressive, and then flew on Apollo 7 after being selected by NASA. And since leaving NASA, he's also been involved in different business ventures, quite a varied career afterwards. So, Walt, would you say a few words, please?
Well, thank you, Leroy, but after you saw that movie, I don't have to say anything. I was trying to learn something there, too. I will make two comments about that movie, though. One, they're still putting out there that we all had a cold, which is not true. The only one who had a cold on that flight was Wally Schirra. And they did a really nice job of improving the television pictures that we took, which you could hardly make out in the originals. And now on that movie, they're clear and nice. I assume you want me to talk about what we're doing on the spacecraft. Well, I find that things have changed significantly from what they were back in the good old days. That's what I think about it, the good old days. And tonight I'll be talking about the golden age of spaceflight, which I see that as. But what has happened is a change in our culture and our society. It's they're now trying to do something about it a little bit. But what people don't realize is how different it is. You hear sometimes people talk about, at one time NASA had a budget that was 4% of the national budget. Well, if you looked at that, you find it was 1 year that they had a 4% of the national budget, and now probably it's about 0.4% of the national budget. Not to mention the fact that as government organizations grow and get older, they become more and more political, and they expand, they add all kinds of things. So NASA now has some of its budget today, which let's say it's right close to $20 billion this year. But they also they have an area out there that's working on education. They have they're out there also spending time, and have spent for years now, on this, what I call the global warming hoax. But what's happening is it's causing a fine organization. NASA was one of the most successful organizations I think they ever established, but now typically they deteriorate. Fortunately, we have a private commercial industry that is always much more efficient in its operations. And while I'm a little bit pessimistic when they first getting started, some of those, I now find that's the opportunity for NASA's future. NASA will get back to what maybe other organizations in history have done. They'll be able to focus on the unusual or the groundbreaking part of it, but they're going to have to depend more and more on the commercial operations. And there are going to be pluses and minuses with that, because you don't have, like with NASA, the government was always there to support them in commercial activities. It's going to depend on how successful they can stay as a business, and I think they've been improving a whole lot, and I'm looking forward to that as a contribution to the future.
All right. Thank you, Walt. Our next panelist, Bonnie Dunbar, very experienced NASA astronaut. During her career at NASA, Bonnie flew 5 shuttle missions, and after leaving NASA, she was up in Washington State for a number of years running the Museum of Flight up there, and then came back to Houston a few years ago to head up a new program at the University of Houston, and she's currently over at Texas A&M University. So, Bonnie?
Well, thank you. My connection to the moon, like Leroy's, actually dates back to when I was a child and was inspired by the Apollo program. I was actually an undergraduate engineer when the first landing was made in 1969. And in fact, it inspired me into engineering. When we finally bought a black and white TV, we saw the NASA engineers in the white lab coats, and that's what I wanted to be first, as well as an astronaut, because those were the best engineers. We were exploring, we were going to the moon. My attitude towards that hasn't changed. We definitely want to explore farther, and Mars is out there, but having worked for Rockwell on the space shuttle and on a spaceship that flew 135 times for 30 years and was a beautifully operating spaceship, I know how much work it takes, and and just like the Apollo missions, it was a stair-step process. You learn, you build, you certify, you go to the next step, you learn to rendezvous and dock. We did the same thing on the shuttle as well. As you'll hear in the test flights, we started putting payloads on there. We started recognizing we had a new environment, more so than we had recognized before. Although we had Apollo and we had Skylab, the space shuttle allowed us to really start to explore the new frontiers of science and biological sciences, as well as fluid physics and biotech and crystal growth and so forth. And it was actually after my first flight in 1985, which was a flight with Germany called Deutschland 1, D1, that I came back and said, I'd trained on almost 100 microgravity research experiments. When's the next shuttle flight with a space lab just like that? And they said, well, we're not planning one in physical sciences. We had some space life sciences flights on the forefront. And, it very much like any other organization, when you start asking questions, they say, well, how would you like to lead a group to explore that question? So Dr. Fletcher, who was administrator at the time, asked me in 1987 to lead a group that was to look at the microgravity research environment, flight opportunities before we built a space station. And out of that came a flight in 92 that I had the opportunity to command called USML-1, United States Microgravity Lab Flight. And like all of the charts we see in life sciences that tries to plot an effect versus gravity, we only have 2 data points, 0 and 1. And we keep forgetting that the moon is a wonderful test bed for us to prepare for Mars, and it's only 3.5 days away, particularly in some of the sciences such as fluid physics, which I've mentioned earlier. But that is foundational for humans in space, environmental control, life support systems, whatever it is that you're thinking about doing, where you have combustion, all of those where it's really important. So I think we need to go back to the moon, not just to keep inspiring exploration, but it is fundamentally important to reduce the risk of going to Mars. It's mentioned before, we can't turn around halfway there. There's a lot we don't know. The moon gives us a fractional G environment. It gives us a radiation environment with GCRs. It gives us a vacuum, even though Mars is not quite a vacuum. It allows us to test habitats and operations. And so I think we need to be thinking, as George said, is that is the next space station stepping stone, a little bit large, and everybody can see it.
All right, thank you, Bonnie. Our next panelist, Fred Hayes. Fred, of course, did get to go around the moon. Fred was a USAF test pilot, and then was on the mission, the lunar module pilot for Apollo 13. And after leaving NASA, Fred went on to work for Grumman, and has been involved in many other things as well. So, Fred, please.
I probably have the most training of anybody to be a lunar explorer that didn't get to be a lunar explorer.
He was really good at it, too.
Yeah, good at it. I trained for 4 missions, Apollo 8, 11, 13, and 16. And actually, on 13, we were the benefactor of what Jack set up through Dr. Lee Silver at Caltech for what I call the first systematic kind of training, field geology training. That continued and grew more in a mission style as we got even smarter about that. And so altogether, I can't count it exactly, but I did over 30 geology field trips through 3 missions. And I tried to recoup some of that training. I volunteered with Jerry Griffin's Gold Team, which lined me up with the second EVA on Apollo 14, where Ed Mitchell and Al Shepard were going to be out on their EVA to search Cone Crater, which was our primary mission on 13. So I thought I might help them out a little bit, possibly. But at any rate, one thing we did do, though, obviously on 13, when we lost the landing mission, we went around the moon a little bit higher than normal. And the angle we were at, we of course had a lot of film, more film than we could ever use, so we shot a lot of pictures. And we had an instructor, Farouk Abbas, he was the sort of the lunar surface instructor, and he came to one of the debriefings and he told us, and I really think he was trying to make us feel good, but he said, "You took the best pictures ever from the backside of 2 major features on the backside. One was Tsiolkovsky, named by the Russians, and the other was Sea of Moscow." So we took 2 pictures, having circumstance and lighting allowed that. I did follow up with time in the space shuttle program for 4 years in a different role. I left the astronaut office and went to work for Aaron Cohen in the Orbiter project office. So I was more in the design development of that. I led, for instance, ops team through the CDR on Enterprise and through the PDR on Columbia, the first orbital bird we had. And of course had the great privilege of going back to the astronaut office and being one of 2 crews to fly the first space shuttle Enterprise. And that was kind of a womb to tomb experience for me, because I'd been through all the design part of it, and now sort of get to go back and now fly the machine for its first time was, I consider, actually the highlight of my career. And flying the Enterprise has paid off. I just got back from Birmingham, England, where I was at a Star Trek event. I think Shatner's lost some favor. He's not kept the right reputation as the commander of the Enterprise. And so I got invited to that event in England and had a lot of fun.
All right, great. Thank you, Fred. Our next panelist has had quite a career in aerospace and has been another regular contributor to ISMS. Mike Lembeck started his career working on the Galileo spacecraft, went to TRW, became a vice president at Orbital Sciences, and then went back to NASA, became the Systems Exploration Mission Directorate up at headquarters, and he helped craft Bush 41's vision for space exploration. After that, he went back into industry, went to the Boeing company, worked on systems engineering for Orion and Constellation, and very recently just joined the University of Illinois as a faculty member in their aerospace engineering department. Mike?
Thanks, Eric. Well, as you can tell, one of these is not like the other. I've spent most of my career developing exploration vehicles and spacecraft for doing exploration. And now at Illinois, I'm teaching the next generation about how to do that. And one of the biggest lessons I try to teach them is to understand what are the requirements and how do we turn that into a spacecraft. And part of understanding requirements is understanding the definition of what you're trying to achieve. And there's two words that typically pop up in talks like this, and those are exploration and settlement. And we have to be clear what we mean by both of those words, or we'll get the wrong result. For instance, we would say we've been doing a lot of exploration on the space station, and I would contend that we've settled into low Earth orbit and not gone much further. And I got to thank Mr. Abbey for bringing me here today, and I think partially it's to stir the pot, and that's why I parked my car way down the street, so when the air is out of my tires, I'll know why. But I would argue that as engineers, we could have used the money that we've used to reverse engineer the human and protect them from the space environment to instead build an environment around the human to allow them to prosper in space. And so it's going to be very important, as Bonnie mentioned, when we get to the moon to understand if 16G is a threshold or do we have to go higher in order to protect humans for long-duration spaceflight. When we talk about settlement, Lewis and Clark didn't really build forts as they moved into the interior of the country. Instead, they backpacked it and they moved forward. So when we go back to the moon to explore, we want to be careful that we don't auger in to a settlement. And instead, we should be packing up the Winnebago to move around the surface, do the exploration we want to do, learn the things we need to move on to Mars, and protect the humans in doing that. We have to rethink also the architectures that we're using so that we can accommodate the new commercial folks that are coming into play here. We have a number of launch vehicles that NASA builds that are not reusable. They are going to have a lot more capability. SLS will have a lot more capability than anything on the street. But we need to think about how we take the most advantage of that. Today, we typically launch vehicles 80% fuel. We need to fly these vehicles empty. And then we can put more high-value hardware on, more research equipment, and in that case, build the commercial market to fly the fuel to orbit in order to fuel these vehicles up. And that way we both prosper, we get to do the jobs quicker, and we get more capability out of it, and not stick with these myths of optimization and complexity is bad and heritage is all about, is the best way to go. I think it's also important to think as we go on to Mars that we don't want to get caught in a chemical propulsion ditch. If we start to build fuel depots and mine the moon for ice that turns into fuel, we'll never get there. We'll kill people on the way instead. And so it's very important to remember that space is an ocean, and you're not going to cross space in a rowboat. And I think that's a really important thing to remember as we start to architect these new systems, build them to accommodate humans in the environment they're used to, and then move forward from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Our next panelist is Oleg Kotov. Oleg is a cosmonaut, and Oleg and I spent a few years together training in the earlier days of the International Space Station, especially in Star City, outside of Moscow. Oleg went on to fly three long-duration flights, so he's got two more than me. And he's a medical doctor, so very recently he also joined the Institute for Biomedical Problems, the IBMP, as a senior leader in that facility. Oleg?
Hello again. So that's what I want to talk about related on moon exploration. I really want to open the question why we need to send the people again to the moon. Because this question, as a cosmonaut, as leader of Institute of Biomedical Problem, I have asked a lot of time because everyone is interesting. Why we need to send the people to do science? Okay, that's not argue because automatic system could do it much better, cheaper, and reliable. And the only one question, only one answer for this question we have. We're gonna use the moon only as a test area for moon exploration, or not for Mars exploration, for future flight. Because this is unique opportunity for us to fly to the moon vicinity or to the surface of the moon in purpose to test our technologies and test our readiness to fly behind the moon toward to the Mars and maybe behind the Mars and next planet. That's why when we built the strategy and our plan how to explore, how to fly to the moon, how to explore the moon in Russian Space Agency in Roscosmos, we thinking about we put in a main goal is that our technology readiness, not the science, because science is going to be like a side effect of this flight. We put the moon flight as a testing our readiness to fly to the Mars. That's why we built or pretending to design the vehicles and suits and some equipment, tools, and with targeting the Mars exploration. Okay, so that's what I want to open up during this session. So thank you. So.
Thank you, Oleg. Our next panelist is Don Pettit. Don is a fellow chemical engineer, which explains why he can build and fix pretty much anything. And Don has flown 2 long-duration flights, and in between he squeezed in a shuttle flight as well. And as I mentioned, I think he's still currently at NASA here at the Johnson Space Center. Don?
My favorite quote dealing with the moon is by Kraft Ericke in 1984. If God intended man to be a spacefaring species, he would have given man a moon. And I love this quote because it plays off of the, if God intended man to fly, he would have given us wings. And of course, we don't have wings, but we're flying. And you think about, well, we have a moon. Wow, maybe we are intended to be spacefaring species. And think about if we had no moon, next stop from planet Earth would be Venus. And I understand that's a real hot place. And Mars, both of which would be technologically trying for somebody who is trying to get off of the planet and figure out how to live and work on another planetary surface. So the moon, I see the moon as an enabler for human beings to become truly spacefaring species so that we can explore anywhere we want in our solar system.
All right, thank you, Don. Our next panelist is Jack Schmidt. Jack, of course, was the Apollo 17 lunar module pilot, the final mission to go land on the moon. He was selected in 1965 as part of the first scientist astronaut group that NASA selected, and he's a professional geologist, the only professional scientist to fly aboard an Apollo mission. After leaving NASA, he dabbled in politics and became a senator from New Mexico, but we'll forgive him for that. And wised up quickly and only served 1 term. And he was also led the NASA Advisory Council for a number of years and has been involved in a lot of different business and other ventures since then. Jack?
Well, thank you. And I congratulate the panel on making some really telling remarks and just saying just about everything I would say about why we need to go to the moon. I might have one other thing to add, but first of all, I just want to remind people, and particularly remind NASA, that they do have a political charter. This administration has given them a charter. NASA, I don't think, has figured out how to focus on that yet, and I hope they will figure that out fairly quickly, because it's extremely important for, I think, humankind and for the future of liberty on this planet for NASA to find a way to focus. On the biomedical side, Bonnie's exactly right. The moon does give us some extraordinary opportunity to actually feed forward into the engineering of going to Mars. If we adapt to 1/6 gravity, then we're certainly going to be able to adapt to 3/8 gravity. And I would just say, Bonnie, that My own qualitative opinion is that I was adapting. Our brains were getting very quickly accustomed to 1/6 gravity. Now, I can't give you any quantitative information yet, but that's something we certainly should get. And finally, with respect to the actual exploration of the Moon and Mars, there is still a great deal to do relative to understanding the Moon and how still it relates back to the early history of the Earth. That is the fundamental thing that the Moon has given us in science, and I think for humanity, because it's in that early history of the Earth that the conditions existed somehow for the organization of complex molecules that ultimately began to replicate themselves. And that period in which that was occurring was extraordinarily violent here on Earth. We know that because of what we know about the Moon. And how does Mars fit into that? Mars is the intermediary. And if the conditions early on in Mars history were such that you began to organize complex molecules, and by the way, I think there's a mineral aspect of this, that's a geological bias, and it's a mineral, the clay minerals have the ability to act as templates for organizing organic molecules. Mars has these kinds of clay minerals, and so in exploring Mars, I think we're going to find that we really are able to look back to the origins of not just human beings, but of life itself.
Thank you, Jack. And last but not least, Bill Shepard, or as we all know him, Shep. Shep was one of the first guys I met when I was a newbie coming down here to the Johnson Space Center, and he and I spent many an hour or so at a time that only exists in our memories now, a place called the Outpost. Shep was the first Navy SEAL that NASA selected as an astronaut, and he was famous for one of the quotes he gave during his interview of the unique qualities that he brought to the program was he knew how to kill a man with his bare hands. But Shep went on with a very successful flying career. He flew on 3 shuttle missions, and he was also the commander of Expedition 1 aboard the International Space Station program. After leaving NASA, Shep went back to the Navy and then retired from the Navy and went on to run different business ventures, and he's involved in all kinds of things now, most of which he can talk about, but I'm sure there's some that he cannot. Shep.
Thanks, Leroy. Most of the important stuff about going to the Moon, I think, has already been said. It's been tremendous comments from the panel. One thing I'd like to relate that happened on our flight that is a little bit relevant. We're on the first expedition. We had some viewports that were looking down at the Earth, and the first couple of weeks were very hectic in our routine. But then about a month into the flight, I'm looking across the service module at where our galley was, and Sergey was there. And I like to drink a lot of coffee, and I was on my second or third cup in the morning. And I'm looking out the window, and we're going over the Straits of Gibraltar, which we had done probably at least once before an earlier pass in the morning, and this was maybe the second or third time we'd been through that area. And I looked over at Sergey, and I said, Sergey, is there any more coffee? And it struck me that how normal being in this condition on this expedition in this strange vehicle for a month had become. I mean, we were totally adapted, that we were in a totally different circumstance, and the Earth was someplace else, but we were doing our own thing. I think this is a characteristic about exploration that'll happen to anybody that goes certainly to the Moon and on to Mars, and we need to embrace that. I want to talk a little bit about Mars. What will an expedition, what will the machines look like when we go to Mars? They're going to be very big vehicles. I think they're going to be bigger than space stations. They're going to be too big to be launched by even the biggest launch systems. They're going to have to be assembled in Earth orbit by people and machines doing various activities. They're going to have to draw on the international skills and resources of a lot of different countries. They're going to use the best of advanced miniaturization, autonomous systems, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at space station today, all those questions are behind us. So space station, in my mind, is a blueprint for how to do this. And the question really remains, we've had people up in orbit almost continuously now, well, continuously for almost the better part of 20 years. And all of us right now are at the point where we have to help our nations and our agencies decide, are humans destined to stay on the home planet or nearby? Are we going to develop the capability to go elsewhere and live and work and be productive? And I think if we don't do that, we will become a different species.
All right, thank you, Shep. And as we begin the discussion, I wanted to see if we could ask for a microphone and a runner to appear so that we can involve the audience. You've got a... Yeah, we need to... Oh, okay, they're coming in? Great, thank you. And so to start out the conversation, I wanted to talk about, the aspect of international cooperation in lunar exploration. One of the findings of the Augustine Committee back in 2008, 2009 was that the International Space Station, one of the big successes of the International Space Station, was the creation of this framework, the structure that allowed all these countries to come together and build this amazing structure and actually operate it. In fact, even those of us who were doing it at the time, the space station went together a lot more smoothly than we expected. We thought that we would have some pretty major hiccups and pieces that didn't fit together, but we really didn't have any of that. We had some minor hiccups, but we got through it okay. And it was just kind of amazing that former Cold War enemies, World War II enemies came together and worked so well together for this. So it seems logical to go ahead and move that forward to all the exploration programs in the future. We've seen NASA kind of go a little bit back and forth, with first, well, we're not putting internationals in the critical path to having a more open mind about that. But then there are a lot of people that perhaps rightly point out, well, if we do it alone, we can do it for less money, because an international program, one of the myths of an international program is that it saves money. I don't think it really does. But anyway, I wanted to open up to the panel to talk about the pros and cons, or what you see as the vision for future lunar exploration. And I wanted to pick a little bit on Oleg, because the Russians a few years ago were talking about the lunar village idea with the European Space Agency and about having ambitions of sending cosmonauts to the moon, but we haven't heard much in the last couple of years. So, Oleg, if I can ask you to comment on that, please.
Yeah, because yes, there was always a Russian plan according to our national space program. So the main goal for the next human space exploration is going to be surface of the moon. And this is pretty close to ESA, European idea to build the moon village as an idea, as a project. But again, we took when they create this project, we're talking about how people can build infrastructure on the surface of the moon to keep alive for a long time, to have a permanent crew on the surface of the moon, or fly up and down to the Earth, maybe with using reusable landers and reusable vehicles and launchers. So fortunately, we see it now in the Gateway project. So as we take a look on this Gateway project, we see what now the main goal, a main change from their free flying around the moon to the more flying on the surface of the moon. And if we see the final version of the project, it looks like a Gateway is a platform infrastructure to support the moon surface activity with reusable heavy lander and reusable light lander, and to serve as a forepost for people on the moon.
Okay, thanks, Oleg. And Jean-Loup, if I can ask you, since you're the European representative on the panel, what is the status now? Do you know? Can you give us some updates on what's going on with Jan Werner's idea of the lunar village?
Yeah, they don't talk. Sorry, are working? Yeah. They they don't talk much about it. From time to time, you see that the program, they have their own meetings and they keep working on it. But I've not seen any public communications since already, I would say, a couple of years. But they work on it. They count on it, and the project is well advanced, and it will happen one day.
Okay. And I wanted to ask our Apollo guys, Walt and Fred and Jack, you guys were at NASA when NASA was brand new pretty much and invented how to go to the moon, and definitely that was an all-American effort. And as I pointed out, there are definite advantages to doing, all one nation. Kind of what are, you guys want to chime in on what do you think about international cooperation for the moon, and or should this all still be kind of a national thing? Especially in light of the fact that the Chinese have announced that they're going. I don't know if they're going as part of the Lunar Village or if they're going to go by themselves.
Well, I see a lot of international cooperation slowly developing here. Part of that drive has to do with the costs of it, although spending money or investing it in that format is not near as efficient as it was before. But when you look back on it, landing a man on the moon in this decade, that was 10 years, and look at where we were technically before that, that was a political decision. It was a political decision based on international relationships, and so it provided some justification to spend what you needed to get it done. Today, we don't have the same drive in our society, and I think probably worldwide it probably is changing. I'm not as much aware of that, but here in the U.S., I don't see the same kind of drive on that. I'm also one of those people that thinks that now that we've been to the moon, that's the place for us to kind of exploit things and get us ready to go maybe to Mars. I see no drive to get to Mars in the next 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. We'll eventually probably go there, but I see it only coming about when you've got to push out the next frontier, and what you develop then benefits you for ages. Look at how long we've been benefiting from the technology developed to go to the moon. But I don't see that coming off. I see if we have international organizations set up to do those things, I see it costing more than it would otherwise and taking a long time to do.
Okay, thanks, Walt. Fred and Jack, do you have a comment to add?
I have a different experience, maybe to talk about a little bit. When I was at Grumman, I had run space programs for 4 years for Grumman, then went off and got in a service wing, had a subsidiary company. And there was an interesting contract we bid and won that I thought I'd go off and work on to do the system integration engineering contract for space station, the early space station Freedom, which was a very difficult program from several aspects, primarily on the U.S. side from the funding shortfall through the early years. In fact, at a point in 1987, if one vote had shifted in the House of Representatives, there'd be no space station today. And so I had a lot of trouble with my workers, even not going out to hunt for new jobs wherein the program would survive. However, the interface I had to deal with, to do the integration job, you need information from all the players, including the European Space Agency, their portion, Japanese with their module, and Canada, SPAR, for the ARM. I had no difficulty at all. I had great cooperation, I'd say, from all the international players. My problem was with the U.S. contractors. It was a combination of this worrying about the funding, but also just a different mix of buying who was playing what roles, the way it was split up in the program. So I, frankly, just from my experience, there was no trouble in being, in that case, I was a contractor supporting NASA at headquarters from the foreign partners and doing what needed to get done and having full cooperation. But of course, the big problem is to get the political alignment. We can talk about it all you want, about international people joining up and mutually funding parts, but somehow that has to be co-aligned more from the political side to make it happen. Once you get the real, I'll call it primarily the engineers and the people who are bought into the mission, I don't think you have any problem at all with those people that are on the job that are trying to get it done working together. That would not be a problem, and you could include, I think, any country, be it Russia or even eventually China, that we could not do that and still, at least on the working level, be okay.
All right, thanks. Jack?
I would just suggest that if you look back at the apex of Apollo from a managerial point of view, NASA had figured out how to do it. It had focused, it had learned its lessons, and obviously accomplished what was set out to be. Just remember that between November of 1968 and November of 1969, we were launching a Saturn V class mission. And by the way, SLS is not close to a Saturn V class mission yet. Every 2 months. Remarkable accomplishment, and it was a managerial accomplishment as much as anything else. And I think that's what's going to have to be replicated if we are going to be able to manage the risks of working in deep space again. As has been said here, near-Earth orbit is very different now than it was, but deep space hasn't changed. You still have to manage all those risks that are out there, and it's going to take a management environment very much like Apollo. I think we've demonstrated what that environment has to be. There's one thing I would point out in that environment, and that is we had 100%, approximately 100% management reserve. And with that 100% management reserve, we could make our milestones. If you hit an unknown engineering problem, you had the funds in order to stay on schedule. If you needed a parallel design effort in order to manage the risks, you could do that with those kind of reserves. Now, do you need 100% now? Probably not. I think we're smarter than we were, and 30% up to critical design review is probably sufficient. But that has to be guaranteed. Otherwise, if you start missing your milestones, you're going to lose your program. Politically, you have to make your milestones. The other thing that we did not have to deal with Apollo, because of the short duration of it, is that you have to be able to stay young. The average age during Apollo was in the 20s. That's not the case today for NASA, and we need to find a way within the to modify civil service rules so that an agency, whatever agency, international or otherwise, can stay young. It's young people that make these things happen. Again, I would say the Apollo management environment was ideal, but we need to make sure you can guarantee having management reserves and that you can guarantee that you're going to stay young.
Okay. And, you know, one of the famous quotes from movies like The Right Stuff is "No Bucks, no Buck Rogers," and that's something we've been talking about here, is frankly the lack of funding. I mean, there hasn't been much funding for exploration for the last at least 10 years, maybe a little bit longer. And as Jack is pointing out, that has everything to do with the politics of the situation, including foreign relations, which ties into the international cooperation side, which is frankly what kind of got us to the International Space Station. And so, you know, I wanted to ask Mike. I mean, with your varied career, you've had quite the the variance or variations in career in your aerospace career. What's it going to take? I mean, we see the idea of this lunar village, which is great with the European Space Agency, but frankly, there was never money to fund that program, and which is probably why we haven't heard much about it lately, although it's ongoing, I understand. Same with the Russian ambitions to go to the moon. I think the only nation that has committed itself politically and funding-wise to go to the moon is China. And I know they're going to do it. And we don't know exactly when, but I think so. But what's it going to take, Mike, for us to get a real program? And to your point about milestones, Jack, I think we have to set them before we can meet them.
Well, if I could just interrupt, I think that, you know, the charter's there. People keep saying NASA doesn't have a charter. It has a charter. I was standing next to the president when he signed it. It's just a question, are you going to implement that charter,
Right.
and how are you going to implement
Well,
it?
you need the money to do it, right?
And I think in terms of beginning to implement it, you have the money, you have the funds.
Right.
The main debate within that funding thing is whether you need to do Gateway or not.
Yeah.
If you put the money in Gateway into a lander program, well, you're pretty much funded for that part of it. Now, again, the reserves aren't there, and they need to be there, and that's up to the Congress and the OMB and the White House to make sure that those reserves are going to be there. But if you start losing milestones, you've lost the program.
Yep.
I have to tell you, the government has changed its priorities on funding significantly in the last 50 years, and I'm not sure how you're going to get them to switch back because there's so many more uses now that are absorbing the money that one of the biggest problems we may have is ever getting enough financing to push things out from where they are.
I think you're absolutely right, Walt. But again, NASA is distracted versus what it was during Apollo. It has all these other, you pointed that out. It has all these other things that is taking management attention. And I say you need to sort of offload that. If you really are serious about the moon and Mars, you're going to have to offload those other responsibilities.
Yeah, Mike, what do you think?
Well, I have to agree with Walt and Jack that, Apollo was very efficient, and it was efficient because it was given a deadline, and so the engineering had to be done to do it, but it was politically driven. Today, NASA is still politically driven, but there are no deadlines, and as a result, I disagree a little bit with Jack. I think it's probably advantageous for companies and the government to miss deadlines because the jobs in Alabama are still there, and they'll stay there longer. So today, to answer your question, Leroy, I think the answer is going to be the narcissist business case. Watch Elon Musk, watch Jeff Bezos, and watch them run circles around what everyone else is doing because they're driven by economics. Mm-hmm. They want to see it done in their lifetime, and they have the wealth in order to actually implement the program that can get it done.
Right.
And they have reserves. At least Bezos does. I'm not sure about Musk.
Yeah, that's going to be our next topic. But before we move on to that, does any of the other panel members like to chime in? Bonnie or Don or Shep?
One really short comment about the international cooperation question. I think all of us here recognize that if the ISS program was not international, we either wouldn't have had the program or we would have lost it.
Yep.
So that's
true.
That's the truth.
We still
Bonnie,
paid
or-
75% of it.
No, I'm interested in audience questions.
Yes. Don, do you have any comments to make?
No comment.
Okay.
These are political questions, and I'm a nuts and bolt person.
Yeah, it's not so much a chemical engineering question. All right, let's go ahead and open the comments or questions from the audience, please, on this topic. I see Dave over here, and
So everything I see.
please wait for the microphone, please, because they have to do they have to do the translation. So
Everything I see is that government's increasingly less relevant, and private sector is very relevant. We have billionaires now, billionaires with discretionary billions. So they're like the railroad barons who came to North America and saw nothing but plains. So they built the railroads, but they deliberately brought people in and planted them in farms all across the country. So they grew crops that the railroads could haul back to the east and make a profit on. And that's how business operates. They find a way to create a product that a customer wants. Now the question is not what happened in the past with NASA. How many of you believe that people will want to go to the moon and be in some sort of Las Vegas style casino or something and be taken up there by Musk or somebody else? Because that's what we're looking at in 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. But all the money will rush to it once it's proven to be successful by a single entity.
all right. Any other comments or questions on this topic from the audience? Yep, over here.
I would like to return to some technical aspects of international cooperation, taking under consideration that there will be some brand new, fit and reliable life support system, which is different from what we have in ISS, because especially what is concerned plants growing and what is concerned waste management. For this very purpose, I should like to stress that international cooperation is peculiarly needed. We know the achievements of different teams all over the world, starting from U.S. with Logan University team, then Chinese team in Beihang University with Lunar Palace, which gain very good results concerning close life support systems. IBMP modest impact in what is concerns the treatment of waste of hygienic means of towels and wipes, which is personal hygiene means. And therefore, I think that it is very important to unite for creation again fit and reliable life support system. In former times, there were an attempt to create life support system international working group, but I not know the exact destiny of this team, this working group. Maybe it is not exist nowadays. Anyway, maybe it's high time to think over about creation of such working group again, for creation of fit and reliable new life support system, including biological life support system. What do you think on this subject?
So I can comment on that. Life support systems on the critical path, and even the commercial companies aren't there yet. It's complex. We've learned over 50 years in this country how to do it. It has major subsystems, air revitalization, waste management, water management, and so forth. And if anything goes wrong, then human life's at risk. Right? And as we move farther from the Earth, the reliability has to go up. The resupply has to go down. Those are all captured risks in the NASA technology plans. I'm not familiar if there is a working group, but there certainly is a lot of emphasis on solving these problems. Many of the papers presented at the International Conference in Environmental Systems, which is held annually here in this country, address that. And at present, the commercial companies are really partnering, for example, with NASA through Space Act agreements and other venues to bring that institutional corporate memory to bear in designing their own systems, because they do not have those independent laboratories on life support, for example. And it's a little bit invisible to see because we've been so successful. You don't see the life support being the problem on Apollo 7. We had to solve some things on Apollo 13. On the shuttle, it worked beautifully, although we had a couple small problems. Air management was fine, cooling was fine. We were able to scrub the LIO the CO2 from the atmosphere. We fixed the waste management system, and it worked. But we're in a brand new world right now that even the International Space Station has some challenges, and the ground mission controllers are continually babysitting and helping to repair the system. At the end of the lifetime of the Mir, I know that doing humidity control and some other challenges were there. So I agree personally that we need to be thinking about more collaboration on life support and technologies, and this again relates back into partial G. We have problems in single-phase and two-phase systems, which are gases and liquids in zero G. How are we going to go to an unknown G or a known G, but not have any empirical data to validate our systems against?
I may be taking a minority position here, but when we went to the moon, we were pushing back the next frontier. I will refer to that a bit tonight. But at the time when we could decide, and everybody decides enough reason for it, when we go to Mars, that is our next frontier now. We've gotten away from the Earth to go to the moon. But now we're talking about escaping the Earth to get to Mars. While I've been curious and tried to stay reasonably informative about it all my life, I don't find one real reason yet for us trying to get ourselves to Mars. Now, I'm strongly in favor of learning about it, and I think we've had a wonderful unmanned exploration of Mars so far. Far better than we ever had for the moon. But I think that the only time that we're going to get to when we go out to Mars is when we need to push back the next frontier, because everything is controlled here, and we want to stick our necks out a little, and then somebody will try to commercialize that. Sorry if I'm the only one that thinks that. But
Let's have one more question before we move on to the next topic. Mark?
This is more a comment, Leroy. The political foundation in the country has been laid here, and they talk about the Trump administration, talk about going to the moon. We have a better than that. In the Authorization Act, it says in the U.S., the long-term goal for NASA human space exploration is to expand permanent human presence beyond LEO. That will involve international, that will involve commercial, and then it goes on to lay out key objectives around that. That's never talked about. That was signed off by the Obama administration, been signed off again by the Trump administration. So it's truly bilateral. Why aren't we using that as an approach and a foundation and a basis?
No, I understand, but there's still no money behind it.
But a step at the time. Congress approved this as
Sure.
approach. That's a basis to go back to them and say, where's the money to make it happen?
Right. Okay, one more quick one?
Number two,
Oh,
we talk about Mars. We go to Mars in Apollo kind of program. It's going to be like Apollo again. We'll
Yeah,
go there,
done.
been there, done that.
Yeah.
We got to get past that in the U.S., in the world, I contend. How do we make this truly a sustainable enterprise? And that's involving internationals and commercial entities in a truly sustainable approach, which is not about destinations, it's about what you do there.
Okay.
Thanks.
Quick one before we move on.
I've got a good nuts and bolts question for the engineers and others on the panel. Bonnie has alluded importantly to the fact that we have very limited experience in partial G environments. And I assume one of the key values we might get out of time on the moon's surface is establishing a permanent habitat and providing for long-term habitation on that surface. What do you think are the biggest top 3 tough challenges in doing that?
That's probably one for Don, right?
Oh, I think that when we're really serious about going back to the moon, all these artist conceptions will be showing astronauts walking on the surface of the moon with shovels, because that's what you're going to need. You're going to need to know, how can you shovel dirt? How can you move it in a conveyor belt? How can you use it as feedstock for converting it into other useful things like bricks and cement and mortar? So that's one aspect of nuts and bolts in a fractional gravity environment. And you put powder on a conveyor belt, and then when you reach the end of the conveyor belt, the powder usually falls off into a bin. But in a fractional gravity environment with charging effects that can happen with powders, you may find that the powder sticks to the belt and it travels for some period of time on the bottom of the belt. And you don't know whether that's going to happen until you go to some place like the moon and you try moving the dirt around, because you want to move the dirt around for all kinds of other uses. So I see the fractional gravity environment of the moon. It's different than the microgravity environment. And it's going to be a challenge for engineers just to figure out how to do that kind of very basic operation. Dig dirt. How do you do it? How do you move it around?
If I could just add one thing to Don's statement. So coming from the Materials and Mining Department at the University of Washington, if you go to a mining operation, just digging and separating is only in the first 2 steps. Now you've got chemical processing, and now you get back into heat and mass transfer. You don't know what chemistry you're using in a fractional G environment in ISRU.
All right, thank you. Well, let's move on to the next big topic, which has been talked or alluded to and mentioned a few times here, and that's the question of commercial companies and their involvement. And I think this is a very exciting time because for the first time, we've always had commercial companies building our spacecraft, but it's always been for NASA and under NASA requirements on a cost-plus basis. And now we've got at least 2 companies, SpaceX and Blue Origin, who have visionary leaders who have the resources financially one way or the other, and they've made the commitment to go and do very complementary things. In the case of Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos, I read recently, yearly sells $1 billion worth of Amazon stock, his personal stock, and I'm assuming that's after-tax $1 billion, and he uses that to fund Blue Origin. He's been doing that, I don't know, for the last 12, 15 years, however long these guys have been going, and he wants to build infrastructure around the Earth and around the moon in order, kind of a field of dreams thing, build it and they'll come. As far as Elon Musk goes, he's made no secret. He started SpaceX because he says he wants to colonize Mars. He's laid out his architecture of how he intends to do it and his plans using his big Falcon rocket in order to go first around the moon and perhaps even land on the moon and then on to Mars. And he's got it all kind of, he's got this high-level architecture anyway of how it's going to work. So interestingly, in the case of Jeff Bezos, he has the personal resources to make it all happen. And in the case of SpaceX, Elon Musk has very carefully maintained over 50% shareholder control so that his, and he's got a business model where he's going to launch satellites or is launching satellites. He's got his intention to build a world or global internet satellite system, which he also, I think, believes or wants to put around Mars. And so he's got a lot of money-making schemes, including the tunneling idea, and he's going to use all this money to finance his goal of colonizing Mars. So with that, sets up a very interesting possibility of a collaboration between the government and commercial companies. And so, as I mentioned before, China so far is the only entity that has pretty much said they're going to the moon. But these commercial companies, it's very interesting because I think they have the resources and the commitment. And so I wonder if we get this panel to kind of opine on all that. What would it take for NASA to work with these companies, or is that even a good idea? Should we just let them run? Anybody want to start off? Mike, you kind of come to mind.
Well, I guess one of the things I think about is logistics. It seems to be where they're taking their stab. Like any good company, you need UPS as your back door to get you the supplies and things you need. And that appears to be where Elon and Jeff have started out. If we look at, is there a market? You start looking at space station. There's a lot of discussion these days about LEO commercialization. And you start to question why hasn't that market flourished over the last 50 years? And the answer may very well be logistics. If you look at the station, it was built to fly as a system with the space shuttle. Since the space shuttle went away, we've lost 3/4 of our logistics capability. So you start to ask, is the market not there, or is it just overly constrained? And the second order question you get, they say we have excess capacity on station today. Well, that might be this much where, it's millions of dollars of things that are being done, where really the folks like Elon and Jeff are interested in the big B, the billions of dollars. So logistics is going to be key to that. That looks to be the place they've started. NASA's picked a different location to embark, and maybe that's the difference.
Okay. Let's open up to the audience, too. If you've got questions or comments on this topic, and while we're waiting for the microphones, anyone else on the panel have an opinion on this topic or would like to make a comment? I know Walt's always got an opinion. Right?
I'm not sure they got enough patience for me again. I take unpopular stands if that's the way I think.
Well, that's why it's to keep it interesting.
Well, I'd be interested in people's thoughts about the commercialization, particularly when it comes to lunar exploration. In my mind, when you talk about commercialization, that implies to me that there's a customer other than the federal government.
Right.
And where it seems like for lunar exploration, I have a hard time imagining a situation where it wouldn't primarily be the government financing the companies in order to achieve whatever goal the government wants to achieve. I guess I'm asking the same question. For lunar exploration, where is the market to finance what would seem to be a fairly expensive undertaking?
Right, and of course the most notable exception to what you're saying, I agree, but there is an exception recently where the Japanese artist, his name escapes me right now, rumored to have paid close to $1 for a lunar flight, circumlunar flight around with 8 of his closest artist friends sometime in the next whenever. But I don't know, is anyone on the... Yeah, Jack, go ahead.
Well, having studied this for the book I wrote on a commercial operation for lunar resources, I think that's where it is. In fact, I wouldn't want the government to start to produce the resources necessary to work in cislunar space or to go on the way to Mars. I think you'll get a much more efficient operation and one which has a potential business case attached to it if you use the private sector for lunar resource development. The one big question since I did the work on the book is who is going to supply a large enough launch vehicle to make that economic, large enough and at a cost that makes it economic. And I don't have an answer to that right now. My guess is the potential is greater within the commercial sector right now than it may be for NASA. Although I am told that the SLS has growth potential to get to the level that I think is required in order to support lunar resource operations. But the primary resource that would ultimately, maybe in a decade or in a couple decades, make this a commercial interest, of course, is helium-3 fusion fuel. And if you can begin to supply power here on Earth with helium-3 fusion, then that's an entirely different marketplace. But that's the only thing I know of that you'd bring back to Earth. The rest of it are resources necessary for use in space.
Yeah, I guess we need to figure out how to build that helium-3 reactor too.
Well, it's being done. I don't know how familiar you are with Tri-Alpha, or now they call themselves TAE, but they are working on technologies that are compatible with it. They're not working specific on helium-3 except in potentially in test operations, but they're looking at the P-Bourne 11 cycle and primarily. But there's a lot of new technology that's been done, and they've been announcing some of it publicly.
Oh, that's good to hear because you always think of the fusion technology as kind of like landing on Mars. We're always about 20 years away.
Well, that's because that's because that work has been confined to the use of tokamaks, and tokamaks really don't have a future commercially. They don't. There's just too many things. They're dependent on deuterium-tritium cycle, and the neutron production of that cycle is just prohibitive. Prohibitive.
Walt, you look like you were about to comment on something. Okay.
Leroy,
right.
one more comment. I mean, getting back to the whole settlement versus exploration argument, for exploration, I don't think there is an alternative to having the government finance it. But when you settle down, we have a model for that already. It was called the Wild West. When the forts were built out there, you started with Miss Kitty's Pub, and you had to stock the pub with alcohol and food and the piano player. At the end of the day, the barkeep had to clean off his bar, so he needs some paper towel from the local Walmart. The kid at the Walmart stocking the paper towel is going to need to go to a movie or do some other sort of entertainment. And so an economy will start to develop on its own, and I think you'll see spontaneous development and settlements of that kind of economic drive. But for exploration itself, that's the government's job. That's what we need to fund and focus it in that direction.
But on the resource side of things, most of that exploration's been done. With what we obtained from the lunar samples that were collected by Apollo, the lunar reconnaissance orbiter imagery and other information that's come since Apollo, for the private sector to seriously consider a resource business case, that exploration's been done. If you're talking about exploration beyond that, and particularly that exploration that's relevant then to Mars in the future, yes, that's definitely something that governments are going to have to fund.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, so let's open it up to the audience. Ask any question you'd like of the panel. Let's see, I think we got someone with a microphone there.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your comments. I'm not hearing much about how the defense sector on the private side plays into commercialization and the future and bootstrapping of our operations in space.
You mean
Would the
something
panel
like the
comment?
X-37 or things like that? Yeah.
I could add one little thought there is, I don't think it's so much the commercialization there, but the military has had pretty high budgets for a long time there, and whether we like it or not, as the space is opening up, and it's tremendous now compared to what it was, I think that military can have a significant role sometime. I can't say exactly if now is exactly the right time or not, but I think that whether we like it or not, any kind of controversy that we now deal with in the ocean or here with missiles on it, that's going to reach out eventually. After we're gone, it'll reach out to the space program too. I mean, out to space.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yes?
Talking about the commercialization and the planned trip for SpaceX around the moon, did we learn enough from Apollo to safely send tourists now around the moon, or is it only for the few people who are highly trained, and do we still even have that information available?
Well, the test pilots here will tell you that the old adage is never fly the A model of anything, but I think they all will go and sign up to fly it anyway. So what do you guys think?
I haven't seen anything about the plan to teach those private commercial people how to go to the bathroom in space.
The bottom line is carefully, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Well, and don't drink a lot of potassium laced orange juice either.
Well, I think part of the answer to that question is these companies are able to hire the people with the experience or with the know-how to help them learn how to do those things. But no doubt the first mission and maybe the first several missions will entail significant risk.
I was going to ask a very similar question back here, but my Zao was going to be the astronaut flying with SpaceX with 8 other crew members with him, and I don't think it's defined yet or who else would fly to support them, and I'd be curious hearing your perspective of what additional assistance might be needed, and sort of a follow-on from that, what would be the minimum critical training that these tourists that maybe are up there by themselves would need if that were to happen from this well-trained, I mean, you all trained pretty well for your missions, and they would have a much more limited scope of time to do that training.
I think the primary thing that companies that offer tourism flights into space, whether they're suborbital or orbital, is that they have to think very carefully about how individuals operate when they get into space. As we know from our past experience, for example, if you start to tumble around in weightlessness, you're going to get sensory conflicts and probably get sick and not have a very pleasant experience for a while. Not everybody, it's very individualistic, but nevertheless, those kind of experiences need to be anticipated. And for example, if you're going to do a relatively short suborbital flight, I'm not sure you want to unstrap until you're absolutely sure that you're going to have a good experience.
Right.
Because if you don't get back in your seat, then the CG is going to be affected on your entry, and that may turn into a really unpleasant experience. So there's a lot of thought, and I think the commercial side of things are going through that now. I visited with some people recently who are involved in trying to help understand those kinds of issues for the commercial sector. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly it's not something you're just going to get into a suborbital spacecraft and go in and have a good time and come back. I think you're going to have to really think it through on how you handle it.
See, I think we've got time for maybe one quick one, Dave.
So my question's for the audience. How many of you have been contacted by a school teacher, elementary school teacher, asking if you would do a phone call with the children in her class about their plan, Lego-sponsored plan for getting humans to Mars? Okay, so look around, and probably some of you 2 or 3 times, there is a revolution underway. At the level where once it imprints in kids' brains, age 9 and 10 and 11, they're going to carry that with them. Okay, and they're designing robots and all kinds of stuff. They've got all kinds of ideas. Whether they're realistic or not, there's a generation coming. So what sounds sort of dire here, it's still, this is still an enterprise that invigorates whole generations coming. And they're going to want to be part of this. They're going to want to go somewhere and do something. So maybe we go back to the moon because we just want to be able to show we can, and we can do a few other things from there, look out in the solar system and do some good science or whatever. But we're probably almost certainly going to have to go, and I think the public's going to expect it, and I think they're going to expect it for the next 20 years.
All right, well, thank you, Dave. If you all join me in thanking our panel. And Mr. Abbey, I give you back the podium on time.